Thank you. So I'm going to start with an African proverb. This morning, Rosalind from Mozilla Foundation, um, she was shy to tweak it. And Rosalind, I was brave enough to tweak that proverb. So it goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far and have impactful, scalable solutions, go together. So that's how I tweaked it, Rosalind. Thank you. I'm going to request my panelists to please introduce themselves, just your name and your role in your organization. And as you do that, so Katie, if you can please just kick us off. Thank you. Just an introduction for now, and then we'll do the first round of questions.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you all. Thank you, African Philanthropy Forum, for hosting this session. My name is Katie Bunton-Wamaru. I'm co-CEO of the African Visionary Fund, and we are a collaborative fund that's entirely focused on driving resources to the actors at the front lines of impact, who are African-founded and led social impact organizations.
Thank you so much, Katie. Latanya?
I'm Latanya Mapp, and I am the CEO and president of the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. I'm based in New York, but have spent most of my career, 25 years, in Africa. So it's very, very good to be back. And I've worked all of it, government, international NGOs. I've even worked for the United Nations. And so I feel like this conversation around collaboratives is timely, because pulling all of those resources together has got to be our goal. Thanks.
Thanks, Latanya. Over to you, Alice.
Good afternoon. My name is Alice Kangede, and I'm the CEO of the Beginnings Fund. It's a new philanthropic initiative that is looking at accelerating reductions in maternal and newborn mortality in Africa. And I'm particularly happy to be here because we're shaping this initiative, and I'm learning a lot. Francois has been very provocative, I would say, in the conversations. So I'm excited that we can take lessons from this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Ruth.
Thank you, Tefaleng. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruth Mapara, the director of Masanawa Africa, based in Cape Town, South Africa. And we support community-based organizations that are striving to improve the lives of children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So before we get into it, let's maybe ground this discussion on the data. What is the data telling us about philanthropic collaboration? So the first thing that we know about philanthropic collaborative funds is that they deliver outsized impact. And we've heard that over and over again, even from the conversation we were having yesterday with the Gates Foundation and Elmer Philanthropies. But we know that they still remain underutilized in the continent. So we are going to delve into how do we change that. We also know that collaborative funds are actually a conduit in channeling resources to proximate leaders with lived experiences. And they're also a conduit in channeling funding to local communities. So how do we enhance that? How do we enhance some of what already exists through the Masanawa Africa to ensure that those resources actually reach local communities? And based on the recent published Brisbane report on philanthropic collaboratives that was actually supported by the Gates Foundation, we now know that the landscape of funder collaboratives in Africa is vibrant. And I know that Francois and some of the experts in the room on collaboratives will say that is a known fact. Yes, it is a known fact. However, we really are encouraged in seeing more and more of the funders working together to actually, reach greater impact and to innovate on solutions and scalable solutions. We also know that systems change is a common aspiration amongst African collaboratives. And this is because of the complex nature of the social issues that we are dealing with on the continent. And that is why the research is actually saying that philanthropic collaboratives in Africa are a bit nuanced when you compare them to global collaboratives. They are nuanced in the sense that there is they are a multi-stakeholder affair. There is government involvement. There is development funders that play a critical part in this. There's philanthropies, but there's also NGOs and the private sector that is quite involved. So having said all of this and all these great things, there are still challenges. And again, this research tells us that 60% of African collaboratives operate on annual budgets of less than 10 million US dollars, whereas 70% of global collaboratives operate on annual budgets above 10 million rands. And so one of the reflection points we'll have today, hopefully, is how do we close that gap in terms of the funding gap between African collaboratives and global collaboratives. Let me now bring my panelists into the conversation. And Katie, I will start with you. Do you want to share with us what you consider to be distinctive about collaborative philanthropy in Africa, especially given what I have shared coming from the Brisbane report, that it seems like it's a vibrant landscape, and like I say, it's a known fact, but what is distinctive about African collaboratives? Over to you.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a great one to start off with. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the kind of ecosystem of collaboratives globally is really growing. It's a really exciting moment. And also that collaborative philanthropy has been around on the continent for decades. So while it's a growing sector and there's a lot of new models, there's also a lot to learn from others who've been in the field for a long time. I think that what is most distinctive about Global South collaboratives and African collaboratives in particular is that there is almost entirely a common goal of getting resources to the ground and getting resources to locally led organizations across many of these collaboratives. And that is kind of the core issue that the African Visionary Fund is really interested in. We are shifting resources directly, but also really trying to influence and support the philanthropic sector more broadly to rewire the pathways to get more funding to the ground. And that might look like direct funding through more African collaboratives. It can kind of look a lot of different ways. And I think that the other piece that is quite distinctive and makes African collaboratives so effective is the way we do that, which is often more equity-centric, more grantee-centric, and more participatory with actors on the ground in general. And sometimes, I think it's important we move away from this idea of equity for equity's sake, which is we're finding a growing and troubling kind of narrative that we're seeing in the field, when in fact, funding equitably leads to better outcomes. It is not only the morally right thing to do to put more power in the hands of those actually affected by the problems we all want to solve, but it is the more effective way to do that. And I think the more we shift that, and African collaboratives as a whole really have that at the core, and I think that's what makes the most difference.
Thank you so much. I took out 3 key themes that came out from what you were saying, Katie. One is the fact that there's still a lot to learn. The second one is being inclusive. And again, this is the constant theme that we are hearing. And in fact, it reminds me of the question that was posed in one of the sessions yesterday, that what if implementers are actually at the center of shaping collaborative funds. So thank you for that. And I think the last one is really about getting funding to the ground, to local communities. Alice, let me come to you. So the Beginnings Fund is a new multi-donor collaborative fund on maternal health. Do you want to just share with us some of the models of collaboration that are particularly effective in addressing some of the local challenges we have on the continent?
Yeah, and I thank you for the question. I think the conversation today has actually been building up to this particular question. What has worked? Which models have worked? And we have had that models that truly include the people that we're seeking to serve, the communities that we're seeking to serve. I want to underline the word truly, because we do a lot of engagement, focus group discussions, but are we actually taking in the lessons and the insights from the people that we seek to serve? So it has to be a very intentional and deliberate effort to include the communities, the governments, the relevant civil society at design stage. Whether it's philanthropy from the global space into Africa, and also from Africa into Africa, we have to bring in the people that we serve. Somebody said yesterday, Africa is a diverse continent. So even in our own countries, I come from Kenya, there are 42 different ethnic groups. So if you're being truly inclusive, it means that it's not just a national conversation, it's also a subnational conversation. Successful models also have been and have to be agile. We design programs, we go in with a hypothesis, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And actually recognizing that and being able to pivot. And here I'll talk to the funders, and I will also be a funder, is that we have to allow room for that, room for agility, room to acknowledge that what we thought as a hypothesis going in will work is not working. We don't have to spend too much time on a mistake because we were part of designing the mistake. We acknowledge it's not working, and we agile and we pivot. Models that work have also been true partnerships with government. Again, I underline here, true partnerships with governments. Not a handshake and a photo op that then allows you to go and do what you want to do in their countries. True partnership means, as Lerato said earlier, most of our government now have roadmaps, they have plans, they have strategies for most of the areas that we're seeking to invest in. Making sure that we actually do take time to understand those plans, internalize them. It would give us opportunities sometimes, bringing our core competencies to sharpen these plans, but it's a true partnership. Because at the end of the day, we are leveraging government infrastructure, leveraging government workforce in areas like education and health, leveraging government policy to be able to advance transformative impact. So a true partnership with government will be sure to help us deliver at scale, to sustain. I'm a Kenyan, so I will use the marathon analogy because I'm proud of the marathoners from Kenya, are also acknowledging that it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. All my love to the Jamaicans, but in this space, it's a marathon, and we have to be willing to stay the time that it will take to drive transformation. To borrow from Rosaline earlier today, we have the successful models are moving away from project thinking into ecosystem thinking, and that's a marathon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alice. A couple of things. One is intentionality. The second one is, again, inclusiveness. And then the third is around through partnerships with government. And I think there's a notion, of course, that working with government can be challenging. But if we are to really realize systems change, there is no way that we can avoid working with government. And I think that's why Elia Ona also made the point that collaboratives in Africa have government at the center if they are to be successful. Latanya. Yes, so Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors is a key role player in philanthropic ecosystems. How do you describe the support that you give to collaboratives? And maybe you can also just touch on the role of fiscal sponsors in nurturing collaboratives.
Okay, that's a big question. Hi, everyone, and thank you, thanks, Katie, to Mosen for the invitation to be here with you this year. It is interesting. I'm just starting my 10th month at RPA, so I'm fairly new, and I think I could still be fairly bold when you're in that 1 year time frame. And so, some of you that don't know RPA is a classic intermediary and maybe one of the first, and certainly one of the largest. And it holds about $1 billion in assets, of which we try to push about $500 to $600 million out into the field with all of our partners. And so collaboratives is one piece of what we do, But I can't overstate that it can't be the only thing you do, because sometimes now we're seeing funders like, oh, I'm gonna push all my money into this collaborative, and partnerships look a lot different than that. And so collaboratives, which I'll come back to, is the one piece, but the second piece, and probably in my mind, the one that seems to have a great deal of growth and influence, is working with smaller philanthropies. So in the US and Europe, even in Africa and Asia, working with family foundations and corporate foundations. I talk about the work that we do now with governments around the world who are looking to be in collaboratives. And then this whole brand and influencer philanthropy that we're seeing has grown significantly, particularly in the US. And so those are high net worth individuals who want to make a difference, who have a passion and are trying to do it a little bit differently. And so collaboratives may speak to them in ways that they maybe haven't before. And the third piece I'll just say is the insights, right? So that is the information, like which Brisbane was just talking about. How do we know what's doing what? I think we said yesterday 130 major global collaboratives. I'm in the field and I could probably count off a few of those, right? So we need to do a little bit more, and RPA wants to be a partner in helping to get the information out about collaboratives so we know what we're working with. And then the final part I'll just say is the fiscal sponsorship, and these are the social entrepreneurs who are just, in my language, the badasses doing all the work. Need support on the back end. And quite frankly, we want them to have support on the back end so they can really test their models and come up with what you were talking about, like what works, what doesn't work. That's the way we see fiscal sponsorship. I'm really full of hope on where we need to go. But the second thing I just wanted to say was just about us not waiting for collaboratives, right? I mean, I think about some of these, funders who haven't really looked at what's to offer already in Africa. We have people that have been starting stuff for decades. I saw BC in the room. We talked about French. These are people who, Deegan, and the people on this stage, who are really the people who are actually starting collaboratives. And so maybe we could just flip it. And that's the way that I hope that RPA can work together with you. And instead of us coming up with the collaboratives and capitals around the world, that we look to the collaboratives that need to be started here with people actually doing the work and gather around them and bring them the collaborative resources, networks, and other things that can come to bear by support. We do spend a great deal of time coming up with what a collaborative looks like. And I would say fundamentally, even the ones in Africa usually come from a funder. How about we let it come from the real entrepreneurs, the real innovators in the places that matter, and then we get behind them. And I think you'll see a lot more of that coming from RPA. And I'll just end with the wealth transfer. And when I think about fiscal sponsorship, when I think about collaboratives, we've all seen the data that we're about to, the baby boomers are about to pass to the Gen Xers by the end of next decade. $84 trillion, right? That's the largest, of course, wealth transfer we've ever seen. But by the end of this decade, it's 73 of that will have been transferred. And the only reason it really matters is that typically what you'll see in that wealth transfer is at least 15% of that is going to go what they define as charitable purposes, right? So we're talking about a time of abundance where we're going to see even more of those dollars coming through, and this is American data, of course, but we know in other parts of the world, and the World Bank was just at the NESG conference in Abuja saying that 1 trillion of that is actually in Nigeria alone. And so these are times that we can celebrate, right? Because it means that there'll be more resources in the ecosystem. I'll call it the philanthropic ecosystem. So it's not a time for us to compete and to scratch and to try to beat the other one out. It actually is a time to partner. And so collaboratives are at the right time and the right space to be able to do this work. I know for RPA it's important, and I just want to say Henrietta Bankole Olusen is our vice president of Africa, and she lives in Lagos with her team. And more of the work that's Africa related has to be based and run by that team. And so she knows I believe truly in that. in order for us to make sure that we're hitting the right mark and that we're able to do the things that are needed for the communities that need them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to push you a little, and I know you will be okay with me doing that.
Of course I will be.
We know that most of the fiscal sponsors are based in the global north. Do you think that there is a trend and an intentionality again to move those fiscal sponsors to the continent?
Absolutely. I pretty much got my job branding it. So, I mean, because my hope is to be able to do that. And I think that so many people also are trying. So it's not like it's a one game show, right? There's so many people right now trying to figure it out in Africa and Asia and Latin America. And we have some really good ideas. And so the statement I made about we don't have to create it in New York is that's exactly what I'm talking about. There are models that we can actually take up. We're going to hear some of them tomorrow, morning at Deacon Ali's breakfast. I mean, there are already people who have come to me in the 10 months that I've been there from every single continent talking about how we can do this together in partnership. So I figure we're actually right around the corner from having a strong, present fiscal sponsor on the continent.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ruth, Masana Africa focuses on smaller organizations, and you actually work very close to impact. What is the comparative advantage of collaborative approach for CBOs, in your opinion? And what is it that Masana Africa brings as a unique approach to collaboratives?
Thanks, Tefaleng. So Masana Africa is, like I said right at the beginning, grant-making organization that supports directly community-based organizations working with children. And it's interesting, as I was reflecting on this topic on collaboratives, and this is something that has been said yesterday, and we've heard a couple of panelists talking to it, that collaboratives, for me, are not new things that have just recently emerged. Even in pre-colonial times, we had collaboratives. And when you think about, cooperatives, people coming together, villages coming together to do agricultural support within the villages, that was part of collaboration within a particular village. And I think the advantage of collaboratives or a collaborative approach is that it leverages resources, a wide range of resources. So it's not only funding. You're looking at networking opportunities. You were talking about leveraging policy with government that can drive systems change. So it's quite important not to look at it from a funding perspective only, but also the opportunities that it can bring, the diverse perspectives that different stakeholders that are part of the collaborative can actually bring. I was in a parallel session earlier on, and some of the NGOs that were part of that conversation spoke about how they don't have access to potential funders. So part of a collaborative approach, and from our experience as Masana, is bringing those opportunities and leveraging those opportunities that we have with other funders to bring these nonprofit organizations into these platforms where they would ordinarily not have access to. So that has been quite positive of the collaborative approaches that we've been part of. So it's not just the funding, it's not just the networking, it's also these policy issues that we're talking about. So the advantage really is leveraging the different and various resources that are at our disposal as funders and network partners. And you asked me about the uniqueness of our approach. So as a funder that is in a collaborative process, we are supporting directly community-based organizations. I think after time, the funding, when it trickles down, it's very little funding that then goes directly to community-based organization. But our support and our approach is let's get the funding directly to the organizations that are doing the work, that are really directly supporting the children and the families that they're working with. And also the issue around multi-year support. There's been a lot of conversations within this forum that we need multi-year support, unrestricted funding. I think that has been a big call from nonprofit organizations. This is something that we've been doing and working together with other funders and partners to say, look, we are dealing with experts here. We're working with people who know the work, the issues, the challenges, and they have the right solutions. And we are providing them with kind of the support, additional support, to enhance and facilitate improvement in quality of programs and quality of lives. So it's really the uniqueness around the approach is the direct funding to local organizations, unrestricted, flexible funding, as well as multi-year funding.
I couldn't have said it better, Ruth. Thank you so, so much. And just reflecting again from yesterday's conversation that was hosted by Gates and Elmer Philanthropists, we were cautioned not to romanticize funding collaboratives. And so I will stay with you. If you can just please share some of the barriers that you've observed with collaboratives and in collaboration. And also maybe if you can not just stay with the problem and inspire some of the solutions as well.
Thank you. I think building off from some of the conversations from yesterday's session, issues around power dynamics, because you have people, different levels, stakeholders in a partnership. You're likely going to have power issues. Also issues around coordination. People have different views, people have different perspectives. So it's how do we coordinate each other around the different perspectives or different approaches. I think all of these issues and barriers around collaborative approach, for me, stem from are the stakeholders like-minded? It is important to have stakeholders within a collaborative who are like-minded, and not just like-minded in terms of the program area or geographic area. It also extends to the approach. Do you have the same approach? Are you understanding each other on the approach? Probably it's project funding versus general support funding. So I think it goes beyond just funding approach, but also the different perspectives as well. So the issues around power dynamics can be solved once you have like-minded partners across the spectrum of engagement, and not just on a funding approach or a program area approach, but the different aspects of the engagement within the multiple stakeholders.
Thank you. Latanya, I would want you to also just stay with the barriers. Mm-hmm. Within your context, what would you think that they are the most recurring challenges in collaboratives? And how can we overcome this, especially when there is a complex partnership with Global North involved, with multiple parties too?
I mean, I think that so much of it is, and I won't repeat what Ruth is saying, but so much of it has, again, to do with what I was talking about with who's the person that, brung it. Where is it coming from? And I think if we can lean into how we do that a little differently, and sometimes it might just mean instead of being the driver, you're the passenger. And your resources are just as important as anything else at the table, which is usually around the solutions, right? And I think that that's the kind of thing that we have to talk about and be honest about, and actually be a little bit bold about, get in the back seat. I got it. We're doing this, we're trying it, we're coming up with the data, we're learning, we're failing, and we're recovering fast. And while that might not be bold in Silicon Valley, I do think for a lot of donors, it coming from African partners, social entrepreneurs, social educators, I think that is sometimes a hard message to swallow. But I think the people in this room, though, get it and can help with that narrative a little bit is that it's okay for us to be in the back seat. It's okay to watch, in this context, Africans build Africa. And so that is the thing that I think at the initial start is something that we all have to work on together in partnership, is how we develop collaboratives, but not just collaboratives. And this is the other barrier that I think Ruth was alluding to some of this as we heard yesterday, but also the diversity at the table means that we have to also be talking to a lot of young philanthropists. And young, it's relative because I'm young too. But we don't use the same language, and I don't know if we're hearing ourselves. And so the way that we talk in these rooms are a lot different than when you're talking about people that are about to take over their family foundations. They're not using the same words. They're not even thinking about philanthropy with the same definition. And I'm at Rockefeller. We've got 100+ old definition of what philanthropy looks like. But even the 7th generation of Rockefeller is not talking in the same way. So we are going to have to catch up. And you'll notice that some of those guys are in these rooms, but most of them are not. And they're using language that we have to get to understand. And because when we think about collaboratives, we don't want it just to be the major foundations, because then that's a limited space. We want it to be a lot broader group of philanthropists to come into the collaboratives instead of doing their own similar thing. We want them to join in. And so that means the language we use, instead of it being a barrier. And I know yesterday we talked about actual languages when you got 43 languages in a country, but I'm just talking about the language around philanthropy. We have to have some shared language that include people, not just us, in the room. So I'll leave it there.
Amazing.
Unless you want me to give some examples of
I was going to say exactly
you want
that.
to ask
Yeah.
really
Please,
into
yes. Because it
Okay,
can't just
so-
be theory. We have to get to the
We
examples.
do.
Yeah.
And so I'll just, do some really quick examples, but it was just renamed La Comina, which is the Women's Political Leadership Fund, and some of you may have even been in that room at UNGA. That was started with resources from OSF, but from Suyan, who is from Guatemala, who had been arrested, was a political leader. She is the story of Women Political Leadership Fund. It's the reason why we have to do this. And instead of waiting, we encouraged OSF not to, like a lot of people, like 4 or 5 people, chip in. Instead of that way of doing it, actually let the person start the fund with the resources available and see how then that comes back. See who gets interested when they're actually meeting the people who started the fund, this collaborative. So the collaborative doesn't have to start with more than, 2, 3 people, but it could actually bring people in. And I think that's the way we'll see it. There's also a way that collaboratives that have been started, let's say Africa No Filter, in Africa, which is one of our collaboratives, I think they're doing such a brilliant thing. And then I hear other donors talking about starting something like that for marginalized voices and, let's just say the Middle East. Why do we have to do that? We have one collaborative. Why can't this one now work together on that continent? Does it always have to be from one way to the other? So I think that's one way to think about it. And tomorrow morning, we'll talk about proximate, but also another one thinking about how do we service our partners. So there's so many, I could go on, but I will not. I think we have some good examples out here already. It's learning from them and quickly trying to challenge ourselves to behave.
Great. No, thank you. Alice, for funders who are just starting out in the space, how do you recommend that they get started? You've just gone through the journey. It's still fresh in your mind. So if you can just share some of the nuggets and some of the experiences that you've had.
The Beginnings Fund hasn't started yet, actually, and I think one thing that I'll say is to listen. Listen to governments, listen to others who have been here before, listen to the people that we seek to serve, listen to civil society. When I first met, his name is Dr. Diallo, who was the head of the World Health Organization in Nairobi. I went on with my spiel, Beginnings Fund, new initiatives looking to accelerate reductions in mortality for maternal and newborn health. He asked me which countries. Oh, mostly in East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, a few to the south, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Malawi, and 2 to the west, Nigeria, Ghana. And he was like, look, typical. No Francophone country, no Lusophone country, same old Anglophone countries. And I said, wow, it was a blind spot for me. I was just spilling the countries, the African countries. We are partnering with African governments. So it's important to listen and make sure that we understand, even as we're looking at data to design programs, what actually are the gaps and some of the blind spots for the funders. I would also say context, which I alluded to earlier in terms of what has been successful, is really being intentional about the context that we are working in. What works in Rwanda could maybe work in Tanzania, but we have to bring along the context that will make it work. And we pay a lot of lip service to this, but it really is, it does make a difference to be truly intentional about context. I'll also say something that was mentioned earlier today is, there are others who have gone before us and done this. And so there are some exemplars to look at. How about we even take those exemplars and scale? We don't always have to build from scratch. And being very humble about that, taking time to scout for these exemplars, and also for those who have gone ahead of us to put together that body of knowledge, such that philanthropies to Africa, from Africa, can take advantage of those resources. And then I will urge the philanthropists from Africa to think beyond their borders, because you will see the big philanthropists, and of course charity begins at home. I will not begrudge any South African for investing in South Africa. But what if, imagine a world if where the Motsepes and Dangotes and more Ibrahims came together and developed or pulled their funding into a Pan-African initiative, such that we don't take away the charity at home in their home countries, but bring that to the Pan-African level. I think it will really be brilliant, where we can draw from their home countries, but actually build a movement that goes beyond specific geographies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll stay with that point for a second, just referencing again the Brisbane research. I think one of the critical challenges in what you're suggesting, Alice, is the facilitation of cross-border funding. The infrastructure, the mechanisms, all of that seems to be a hurdle. And so I think it's one of the key takeaways from that research report in terms of just maybe reflecting on what can be done, to overcome that hurdle. But thank you so much for sharing some of those insights. Staying with the best practices and what can be done, I'm coming back to you, Katie. What are the best practices, at least from your experience, that you have seen in managing philanthropic collaborations in Africa?
Thank you, and I think a lot of them have already been mentioned. Multi-year, unrestricted funding, getting funding to grassroots actors, involving them in strategies from the jump. I think to kind of build on that point, how are African-led organizations involved in your governance as a collective? For us, that has looked like, the African Visionary Fund was founded by a founding working group predominantly made up of African social impact leaders. Our grant-making committee continues to be made up of some of our grantee partners, in fact. And so kind of at every level of our governance, we're thinking about that we're truly accountable to the leaders that we're funding, and very intentional about not including funders in our governance, which I think can create difficult conversations that we have to manage. But really, we need to be accountable to those people on the ground. And to LaTanya's point, encourage funders to take a back seat and see their role as supporters of change, not directors of change. And that, for me, really comes to another kind of best practice around narrative change. And Moki yesterday at the Collaboratives event talked about that narrative change matters. I think a real barrier in collaborative funding today is the way we recognize and often overlook local expertise and see locally led organizations as implementers rather than truly essential partners that need to be involved from the jump. And that kind of limited perception of African-led organizations as doers rather than thinkers, I think contributes to why they're not involved in governance often, and then not the people that we should be really accountable to.
Thank you. We will have an opportunity to take a couple of questions from the floor, but before we do that, I think most of the folks here would be interested in knowing how do we really close the funding gap. I referenced some of the statistics in my opening remarks. We know that there's a funding gap between the African collaboratives and the global collaboratives. And I'm going to challenge my panelists here. Please don't kill me after this, because I want you to say something that will be memorable, that will stay with the audience. 2 words in how we can close the gap in terms of like the funding collaboratives.
I'm gonna break the rules. So I can't say in 2 words. I think we have to acknowledge the way that anti-Blackness and racism plays into that funding gap. And we often don't wanna have that conversation.
Latanya?
Okay, 2 words. So, yeah, I guess I'll have to break it just a little bit too. Thank you. I'll break it just a little bit too. But I do think we're going to have to get bolder in order to find bigger bets, bigger solutions, and solve the bigger problems that we have. What do we do?
Any other reflections?
More than 2 words, but around giving. Chairman said earlier today, most Africans are actually philanthropists. Every single month, we are sending money to relatives. Especially in Kenya, we have M-Pesa, so it's on your phone. So you're sending money for school fees, for healthcare, for the cow that died, you name it. We give, it doesn't matter at what scale, we give almost every single month, if you're salaried and even if you're not. So the challenge is, how can we even begin to pull that and organize that as part of the philanthropy from Africa? So it's the wealthy, yes, but it's also all of us who are already giving, but it's just not consolidated.
And just to add on to that, we need to be intentional and genuine. I think that's the bottom line. Are we genuine enough to improve, to push the development agenda? If we are not, it's going to be difficult for us to bridge that gap that we are talking about. So are we genuine enough and are we intentional enough to be able to push the resources to where they're supposed to be, which is to the communities themselves? So it's really about harnessing also those resources that are within our disposal to be able to direct them to communities and to the people that need them the most.
Okay, I failed. The 2 words didn't work. I failed dismally, but I'm hoping that you were able to at least sum up what the panelists were saying. Can we take a couple of questions from the floor? We have a couple of minutes. Katie, I recognize you. If we can bring the mic here on this table and then the gentleman on the other side of the room. Thank you. Please go ahead, sir. You can go ahead. So,
okay.
We'll come to you just now, Katie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that was a very powerful panel. My name is Agri Aluso, and I work for Resilience Action Network Africa. And I just have a few reflections based on the very important interventions that have been put forth by the panelists over there. I think there's a great opportunity, unique rather, for African philanthropies to address challenges that probably have been a little challenging for philanthropies that are outside Africa. So I've worked for philanthropy before, both sides of the engagement. And I know sometimes very good intentioned gestures are externalized and you're branded as if you are fronting some external agenda, which, if you are a philanthropy that is grounded and working in Africa, then you have that legitimacy and voice to really, drive agenda that cannot be externalized because you come from there. But I also just wanted to, one thing that I had some panelists say, and I agree, we have to align a lot of times with what governments have prioritized. And by the caution, what I've seen in a number of instances, governments are very good at crafting certain narratives for capacity deficits on selected issues because they have learned or they've been conditioned to know that those are the areas people are amenable to support. And you'd find, and these are the most critical sectors that have the capacity to really address the inequalities, health, education, water and sanitation. And therefore, as we embrace and want to leverage on what government is doing, I think we also need to problematize what we are addressing so that what we are doing is strategic and catalyze actions that really drive political accountability that is sustainable and not just bridging gaps that have been presented to us. Some of those gaps need further drilling and asking ourselves, how did they come to be? And what really needs to be addressed? Is it a technical challenge or is it a political challenge? So that we are not prescribing wrong solutions to problems that probably require political redress instead of technical support. Thank you.
Thank you for your contributions. I think it was more comments than it was a question. Thank you so much for adding to the conversation. This table, please.
Hi, Katie Smith-Milway from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you for a terrific panel. And I was just reflecting as you were talking about how so many collaboratives currently tend to be funder collaboratives and the importance of moving to a more of a mixed governance where you have the people you're trying to help and government, et cetera. And I just wondered, what in your experience do you find tricky about the current power dynamics with all funders? And does it get trickier when you have a more mixed group or less so? And if it's more so, how would you mitigate?
Any other questions before I bring it back? Okay, I recognize 3 questions and that will be it for the day. So my sister right at the back, and then there's a gentleman there, and then the gentleman on this side. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay,
yes, go ahead. We only have one roving mic, so if you have the mic, you can speak.
Quick one, great. My name is Walid Tadida. I work with Bold Legal Philanthropy, but my question is around how do we make sure that we don't compromise on agility within collaboratives? We support a lot of collaboratives, funders, and we usually see that sometimes slow down the speed at which you can make decisions and get money out the door so you can get everyone in agreement. So how could we not compromise on agility while working in collaboratives, specifically that we're dealing with a lot of urgent issues across the continent and the world?
Thank you. So the lady right at the back.
Hello, yes, thank you. My name is Marie-Ange. I'm from Solid Africa, based in Rwanda. My question was at the intersection of what Ruth said and Alice. You spoke about unrestricted multi-year funding for grassroots organizations, and this is very important. And Alice, you spoke about agility and having the opportunity to pivot when an intervention is not working. On the side of the implementer, my question is, how do we actually include a framework in the multi-year unrestricted funding? How do we put in the agility that is needed? Meaning, how do we bake in risk into the funding, into the design of the funding, to allow implementers to do that system change through unrestricted multi-year and have the agility that is needed to drive and achieve system change? How do we bake in risk as funders, as collaboratives, into the design of our funding?
Thank you so much. One last question and then we'll bring it back to the panelists.
Thank you to the panelists, for everyone. This has been very informative. My name is Wayne Norton. I work with SimGod Solar. We're do engineering, procurement, and construction on a large scale for battery storage and solar projects around the world. My question is, how can we reverse engineer the funding for projects for substantial problems that everyone can agree upon? You know, a lot of the things that we talk about today, I hear there's controversy around these things, but energy is something everyone needs. Clean power is something that a lot of countries in different parts of the world lack. So how can we create a fund specifically for those, what I call low-hanging fruit, to create the larger communities?
Thank you so much. I will paraphrase some of the questions quickly. One is around the power dynamics and the fact that when you have mixed groups in these collaboratives, there are complex governance structures. How do you actually deal with that? So whoever is willing to take that question, please do.
Oh boy, so, I mean, you guys are throwing the bangers. I mean, we have 22 seconds left. So some of it is very difficult to answer in a short session, but I certainly believe these are things that we can take with us. I do think that, so I'm at RPA, oh my God, that's all we do is this, trying to figure out how to make it work better, and how to make sure, we've even split up how we've done it with some collaboratives as well as, supporting social entrepreneurs and fiscal sponsorship, because it's very different working with the donors than it is working with the person who has the idea and is actually implementing it on the ground. And so I could write like a whole version of my first 9 months on this, or we could just come together and talk about how we're coming up as we go with ideas on how to make collaboratives, and not just, RPA, my God, everybody in here. It's like just a process. And for us, it's been very important because the way that the resources are utilized in collaboratives actually can help get more money to where it's supposed to go, if that makes sense. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And then the two questions were very similar because it was around how do we bake risks in these collaboratives, how can we become more agile? And it was more to Ruth and Alice, and you both can decide who's taking this one because we don't have time. So one person can take it and we can close. Thank you.
I'll give it a step and Alice can add. I think, it's about having a discussion with all the stakeholders in the room. And like I said in the beginning around, agility, it goes to, are you dealing with, or are you in a conversation with like-minded partners or stakeholders? And it's not just like-minded in one aspect, it's across the spectrum. Is it the approach? Is it the program area? Is it the geographic area that you're talking about? So having a common denominator across the different aspects of that relationship or partnership is essential. And then that will deal with your risk, that will deal with your agility aspect of it. So it's important just to have commonality across the different aspects of that discussion.
Alice Gates says, just don't stop me, I'm going to go ahead and say something. So please go ahead, Alice.
It was a good look.
You can use this one.
Whoever is managing time is quite good at their job. So it's back to the question on implementers. I think this is where somebody said earlier, the funders have to look inside the mirror and hold themselves to the same standards that they are holding the implementers. I don't think baking risk has got all to be on the shoulders of the implementer. The funding should be structured such that there is room to pivot, and not 3%. It's true room to pivot. In my previous life, I worked at CHAI, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, and I remember designing programs with a lot of back and forth with some of the funders, but where we would not even program all the money because there were things that were unknown, but because of the urgency of the issue we were trying to address, we had to go in and start tackling it. Think HIV care and treatment. And knowing that we would figure it, some of it while we are at it, did not program all the money to allow us to do exactly that. But this cannot be on implementers alone. Funders honestly have to give room to this. Otherwise, we will have a checklist where the sum total of objectives on that log frame are met, but there's no transformation or change.
Thank you, thank you. On that note, I'm going to sum up and we can close the session. Otherwise, Yinka is going to kill me. So a couple of points. One, what we've heard today is really about inclusivity. It is about centering implementers as well as we try shape these collaboratives. Secondly, it's about leveraging what already exists. Why do we have to always reinvent the wheel? Thirdly, collaboratives in Africa are not just about funding. There are more to. There is more to funding. There's leveraging the government. There's talking about policies. There's all these other things that are critical enablers in making collaboratives successful. It's about getting funding to local communities, and we also have to reflect on the diaspora giving. I know we didn't talk about that a lot today, but it was highlighted as the key topics to reflect on. And also, Ruth, I liked what you said around being intentional and genuine in terms of at least closing that gap of funding between African collaboratives and global collaboratives. On that note, I would like to thank my fellow panelists for the amazing job. Thank you, thank you, thank you.